The moon hung low, its silver light casting jagged shadows across the deserted backroads of Appalachia. The night was cold and unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your own breath feel like a betrayal. Mia and her friends, Sam, Brooke, and Ethan, were heading home from a music festival deep in the countryside. Their laughter had subsided hours ago as the dense forest swallowed their car, the narrow roads becoming more twisted and unfamiliar with each turn. Sam, who was driving, gripped the wheel tightly. His confident bravado had faded, replaced by a nervous tension he tried to mask. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Brooke asked, her voice a thin thread of worry. Sam glanced at the GPS on his phone. "It says it's a shortcut," he replied, though even he didn't believe it. The map flickered, then froze. A circle spun endlessly before the screen went dark. "Great," Ethan muttered, peering out the window at the dark trees pressing close to the car. "We're officially lost." The group fell into an uneasy silence. The road narrowed further, barely wide enough for the car to squeeze through. Branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside. Then, as if mocking their predicament, the car sputtered and jolted to a stop. Sam cursed and turned the key, but the engine only groaned in protest. "Perfect timing," Brooke snapped. She pulled her jacket tighter around her. "What now?" "We walk," Ethan suggested. "There's got to be a house or a gas station around here somewhere." Mia hesitated. The dark woods felt alive, watching, waiting. "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if we stay here and wait for help?" Sam shook his head. "There's no signal, and it could be hours before anyone comes this way. We'll freeze before then." Reluctantly, they grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and set off, leaving the car behind. The road seemed endless, the darkness growing heavier with each step. The air was thick, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to their throats. After what felt like an eternity, they spotted a faint light in the distance. It flickered like a dying ember, but it was enough to pull them forward. They quickened their pace, relief mingling with apprehension. The light led them to an old wooden house perched at the edge of a clearing. It leaned to one side, its sagging roof and peeling paint speaking of years of neglect. A dim bulb swung from the porch, casting eerie shadows across the warped boards. "This doesn't look promising," Brooke whispered. "Better than the woods," Sam said, marching up the steps. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. They waited, but no one answered. "Let's just go," Mia urged, her voice trembling. But Sam pushed the door, and it creaked open with a groan. "Hello?" he called out, stepping inside. The others followed reluctantly. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and furniture lay scattered as though abandoned in a hurry. A single photograph rested on a mantel above the fireplace. A family of 4, their smiles wide but eyes strangely lifeless. "Maybe no one's lived here for years," Ethan suggested, though his voice was tight with unease. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. They spun around, the flashlight beam jittering wildly. Sam rushed back to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Locked?" Brooke asked, her voice rising in panic. "From the outside," Sam said grimly. A low creaking sound echoed from upstairs like footsteps on old wood. They froze, staring up at the dark staircase. "Who's there?" Mia called out, her voice shaking. No answer came, but the creaking continued, deliberate and heavy. "Let's get out of here," Brooke whispered. Ethan shone the flashlight up the stairs. "Maybe it's just the wind." The light caught something at the top of the stairs. A figure standing still, its face shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak. Then, as the light lingered, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Run," Sam said, his voice a hoarse whisper. They bolted, scattering through the house in their panic. Mia and Ethan ran toward the kitchen. Brooke darted into what looked like a parlor, and Sam tried a side door, hoping for an exit. Mia and Ethan found themselves in a room filled with jars, dozens of them lining the shelves. Their contents were murky, floating shapes that made Mia's stomach churn. She leaned closer to one and gasped. A human eye stared back at her, suspended in yellowed fluid. "Let's go," Ethan hissed, pulling her away. In the parlor, Brooke stumbled over something soft. She looked down and screamed. A lifeless body lay sprawled across the rug, its face contorted in terror. Before she could flee, a cold hand gripped her ankle. She turned to see the same figure from the stairs, its face pale and sunken, eyes hollow and dripping black ichor. "Help!" Brooke screamed, her voice echoing through the house. Mia and Ethan burst into the room just in time to see Brooke being dragged into the shadows. Ethan lunged forward, but Brooke was gone, her scream fading into silence. The figure turned to them, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. They ran, the house a labyrinth of narrow hallways and dead ends. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until it was almost impossible to breathe. Sam appeared out of nowhere, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Where's Brooke?" he demanded. "She's gone." Mia choked out. "We have to get out of here." They reached the front door, but it still wouldn't budge. Desperation took hold, and Ethan began kicking at the wood. With a final, splintering crack, the door gave way, and they stumbled outside. The woods were no safer. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. They ran blindly, the flashlight flickering. Behind them, they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like laughter distorted into a nightmarish growl. Mia tripped, falling hard onto the ground. She looked up to see the figure looming over her, its grin impossibly wide, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It leaned closer, whispering something she couldn't understand, its voice like nails on glass. Before it could reach her, Sam and Ethan grabbed her arms, pulling her to her feet. They ran until their lungs burned, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance. When they finally reached the road, the sun was beginning to rise, its light washing over the forest. They collapsed onto the asphalt, trembling and gasping for air. The car was nowhere in sight, and neither was Brooke. The three of them never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night, Mia would hear it, the faint creak of footsteps and the low, guttural laughter, as though the figure had followed her home.
Next story.
The air was thick with the scent of pine as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Beside him, Sarah studied the map on her phone, her face illuminated by its eerie glow. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jake asked, his voice betraying his unease. Sarah frowned. "It's supposed to be a shortcut. The app says we'll save 20 minutes. Jake glanced at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes before turning back to the narrow road ahead. The paved highway had given way to cracked asphalt, then to a gravel path that seemed to snake endlessly through the dense forest. The further they drove, the darker it became, the trees closing in like walls. The GPS chimed, its robotic voice eerily cheerful. "Turn left." Jake hesitated as he saw the road in question. It was barely more than a dirt trail that choked with weeds and shadowed by the looming trees. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "Just trust it," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. With a sigh, Jake turned onto the path. The car jolted over rocks and roots, the headlights barely piercing the oppressive darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the forest grew denser, the silence broken only by the crunch of tires and the occasional cry of an unseen animal. Then the GPS spoke again. "You have arrived." Both Jake and Sarah stared at the screen in confusion. The map displayed a pin in the middle of nowhere. There was no sign of a destination, just more trees and the oppressive darkness. "Great," Jake muttered. "This thing is useless." Sarah's phone screen flickered, then went black. She tapped it, panic creeping into her voice. "It just died. I had 60% battery a minute ago." Jake glanced at his own phone. No signal, no GPS. Nothing. "I guess we turn back," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He shifted the car into reverse, but as he did, the engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, then went out, plunging them into darkness. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, but refused to start. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." He turned to where she was pointing. In the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. It was tall, impossibly thin, its face obscured by shadow. "Hey," Jake shouted, stepping out of the car. "Do you need help?" "Jake? No," Sarah hissed, clutching his arm. But he shook her off, striding toward the figure. As he approached, the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, unnervingly still. "Hello?" Jake called again, but his voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. He was close enough now to make out details, the tattered clothing, the pale, almost translucent skin, the unnatural stillness of its form. And then it moved, not toward him, but sideways with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if it were a puppet on invisible strings. Jake froze, a chill running down his spine. He realized too late that there were no footsteps. The figure made no sound as it moved. "Get back in the car," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. Jake obeyed, slamming the door behind him. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his breath fogging the cold air. Before Sarah could answer, a loud knock echoed through the car. They both jumped, turning to see a handprint on the rear window, small, childlike, but smeared with something dark. Sarah screamed as another knock came from her side, then another and another. The car was surrounded, shadowy forms pressing against the glass. Their faces were pale and blank, eyes hollow pits of darkness. Jake frantically tried the ignition again, and this time, the engine roared to life. He didn't think, didn't look, just floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, scattering the figures like leaves in the wind. The road twisted and turned, and Jake pushed the car harder, the speedometer climbing dangerously high. The figures were gone, but the oppressive feeling remained, a weight pressing down on them. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. Jake followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Standing in the middle of the road was the same tall figure, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its arms hung limply at its sides. But as they approached, they began to rise, as if to welcome them. "Hold on!" Jake shouted, swerving hard to avoid it. The car veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The airbags deployed with a deafening bang, and for a moment, everything was silent. Jake groaned, struggling to free himself from the deflated airbag. "Sarah, are you okay?" There was no response. "Sarah!" He turned to find her seat empty, the door wide open. Panic surged through him as he scrambled out of the car. "Sarah!" He shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed, but there was no answer. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. And then he saw her. She was standing a few feet away, facing away from him. Her body was rigid, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Sarah?" Jake called, his voice trembling. He took a step toward her, then another. "Are you okay?" As he reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned. Her face was wrong. Her eyes black pits, her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. Jake stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, this isn't real. The last thing he saw was Sarah, or whatever she had become, lunging at him, her mouth opening impossibly wide. The car was discovered a week later, abandoned in the woods. The police found no sign of Jake or Sarah. The locals whispered of the forest and its curse, warning travelers to stay away from the old dirt road. But some nights, when the wind is just right, they say you can hear voices calling for help. If you listen closely, you might even hear the laughter.
Next story.
It was supposed to be an uneventful weekend getaway. Lisa, Jake, and their friends, Mark and Sarah, had planned a road trip to a remote mountain cabin to escape the city noise. Armed with snacks, a playlist of old-school rock, and a paper map, since cell reception was spotty in the mountains, they set out at sunrise. The drive was picturesque, with winding roads cutting through dense forests that seemed to go on forever. But as they climbed higher, the roads narrowed, and the forest grew darker and more ominous. A thick mist began to creep in, dulling the vibrant green of the trees. "Maybe we should have gone during the day," Sarah mumbled, peering out the window. "It's fine," Jake replied confidently. "We've got the map, and if we just follow the signs, we'll be at the cabin in no time." But the signs weren't as clear as they'd hoped. At a particularly confusing fork, Jake slowed the car. The sign was old, the lettering nearly illegible. "Left or right?" he asked. Mark squinted at the map. "Left should lead us to the cabin." Lisa hesitated. "I think we should turn right. The left road looks weird." "Weird how?" Mark laughed, but it came out nervous. Lisa shrugged, but the feeling of unease in her stomach tightened. Still, Jake trusted Mark's navigation, and they turned left. Almost immediately, the road began to deteriorate. Potholes dotted the dirt path, and the trees leaned unnaturally, laced, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The mist thickened, curling into strange shapes that seemed to watch them as they drove deeper into the woods. The car jolted as the back wheel sank into a hidden hole. Jake swore under his breath as the vehicle came to a sudden stop. "Great," Mark groaned. "Flat tire?" Jake nodded, stepping out to assess the damage. The others reluctantly followed. The air outside was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. "Let's change it quick," Jake said, retrieving the spare tire from the trunk. But as he worked, Lisa wandered a few steps into the woods, drawn by an odd sound, a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. "Lisa?" Sarah called, her voice tinged with fear. "What are you doing?" Lisa turned back, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" The others shook their heads. "Hear what?" Jake asked, tightening the last lug nut. "It's like someone whispering." Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper herself. "Probably the wind," Mark said dismissively, though his eyes darted nervously around the trees. "Let's just get back in the car," Jake urged. "We'll find our way back to the main road." But when they got back inside and tried to start the car, the engine sputtered and died. Jake tried again. Nothing. The headlights flickered once before plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. "What now?" Sarah whispered, clutching Mark's arm. "We wait," Jake said firmly, though his voice trembled. "It's too dangerous to walk in the dark." Minutes turned into hours. The mist thickened outside the windows, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, a soft tap against the car's rear window. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Shh!" Jake hissed, gripping the steering wheel like it could somehow protect them. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It moved, traveling along the side of the car as though something or someone was circling them. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, though his voice cracked. No answer, only the sound of something scraping against the car door, slow and deliberate. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said, fumbling for her phone. But as expected, there was no signal. Suddenly, the car shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. Sarah screamed, and Mark reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment. He flicked it on, aiming the beam out the window. At first, they saw nothing but the mist. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. The thing stared at them, unblinking. Then it smiled, a grotesque, toothy grin that stretched impossibly wide. "Drive!" Lisa screamed. "I can't!" Jake shouted, frantically turning the key. The engine refused to start. The creature began to move closer, its long fingers dragging against the hood of the car. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. It climbed onto the roof, the metal groaning under its weight. "What does it want?" Sarah sobbed, covering her ears. Suddenly, the roof caved in slightly, and the thing's face appeared upside down in the windshield, peering in with its glowing eyes. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers Lisa had heard earlier filled the car, growing louder and more chaotic. Mark snapped. "We have to run!" "Are you insane?" Jake yelled. "It'll catch us!" But before anyone could respond, the creature slammed its fist against the windshield, cracking it. That was all the motivation they needed. Throwing the doors open, they bolted into the woods, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as Mark led the way. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and mist. Branches clawed at their clothes, and the whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. Behind them, the creature's guttural growls echoed, closing the distance. "We're going in circles," Sarah cried, tripping over a root. Jake helped her up, his face pale. "Keep moving." Lisa glanced over her shoulder and froze. The creature was no longer chasing them on foot. Instead, it was perched high in the trees, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as it watched them with that grotesque grin. "Run," Lisa screamed, and they surged forward, adrenaline overriding their exhaustion. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing where an old, decrepit cabin stood. Desperate, they threw themselves inside, slamming the door shut. The interior was cold and smelled of decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. "What now?" Mark panted, leaning against the door. "We wait," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the whispers found them again, louder and angrier. The cabin grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. The walls began to shake, and the creature's face appeared in the cracked window, its grin wider than ever. The door burst open, and darkness swallowed them whole.
Next story.
The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through a dense forest shrouded in mist. The asphalt was slick with rain, and the headlights of Henry's car barely pierced the gloom. He adjusted his rearview mirror, glancing at his fiancée, Clara, asleep in the passenger seat, her blonde hair spilling over the headrest. They were on their way to a secluded cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. The GPS had taken them on a supposed shortcut, but as the miles dragged on, Henry began to doubt its wisdom. The trees pressed closer to the road, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. As he rounded a sharp bend, a sign loomed out of the darkness, its paint faded and peeling. Route 13, detour ahead. Henry frowned. The GPS hadn't mentioned a detour, but the road narrowed abruptly, forcing him to slow down. He veered onto the detour, the tires crunching gravel as the pavement ended. The forest seemed darker here, the mist thicker. Clara stirred, blinking groggily. "Where are we?" she murmured, sitting up. "Not sure," Henry admitted. "The GPS is acting up, and there was a detour. But we'll get there soon, don't worry." Clara glanced out the window, her brow furrowing. "I don't remember seeing this on the map. Are you sure we're not lost?" Henry opened his mouth to reassure her when the car jerked violently. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in suffocating silence. He tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. "Great," he muttered, slamming his hands on the wheel. Clara hugged herself, her breath fogging up the window. "What now?" "I'll check the engine," Henry said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. He stepped out, the cold biting through his jacket. The flashlight beam danced over the hood as he opened it, revealing a tangle of steaming components. Nothing looked obviously wrong, but the engine refused to cooperate. He slammed the hood shut and turned to Clara, only to freeze. A figure stood in the road behind the car, illuminated faintly by the taillights. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Clara," Henry hissed, his voice barely audible. "Stay in the car." Clara turned, her eyes widening as she saw the figure. It didn't move, didn't speak. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. Gathering his courage, he called out, "Hey, do you need help?" The figure tilted its head, almost inquisitively, but said nothing. Then, without warning, it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the mist. Henry hurried back to the car, locking the doors behind him. "We're not staying here," he said, his voice firm. "The car won't start," Clara reminded him, her voice trembling. "Then we walk," he said, glancing at the flashlight. "There has to be a house or a gas station somewhere." They set off down the road, the beam of the flashlight their only guide. The forest felt alive, the trees creaking and groaning as though whispering secrets to one another. Every so often, Clara would glance over her shoulder, certain they were being followed, but the road remained empty. After what felt like hours, they spotted a faint glow ahead. Relief surged through them as they approached a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Mabel's Diner. The windows were fogged up and the inside looked deserted, but the door was unlocked. They stepped in, the bell above the door jingling softly. The diner was eerily still, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and grease. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to them. Her uniform was pristine, but something about her posture was off, too rigid, too unnatural. "Excuse me?" Henry said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Our car broke down. Can we use your phone?" The waitress didn't respond. Henry and Clara exchanged uneasy glances. He stepped closer. "Ma'am?" The waitress turned slowly, and Clara gasped. Her face was smooth, featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank, pale skin. Henry stumbled back, his heart pounding. Before they could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the diner into darkness. "Run!" Clara screamed, grabbing Henry's hand. They bolted out the door, the bell jingling madly as it slammed shut behind them. The road was pitch black now, the flashlight barely holding its charge. They ran blindly, their breaths ragged, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. Clara dared a glance back and saw the figure from the road, its hat now missing to reveal an equally featureless face. It was closer than before, its long limbs moving with unnatural speed. Henry pulled her forward, his grip iron tight. "We're almost there," he lied, though he had no idea where they were going. The mist grew thicker, obscuring everything. Suddenly, they stumbled into another clearing. A dilapidated house loomed before them, its windows dark and hollow like empty sockets. With no other options, they ran inside, slamming the door behind them. The house was freezing, the air damp and heavy. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting and writhing as though alive. Clara clung to Henry, her tears silent but constant. "We'll be fine," Henry whispered, though his own voice betrayed him. A low, guttural sound echoed through the house, like laughter dragged from the depths of a nightmare. The figure was inside. "Upstairs!" Henry shouted, dragging Clara toward the staircase. They sprinted to the second floor, finding a room with a single window. Henry threw it open, revealing a drop into the dark woods below. "It's our only chance," he said, helping Clara climb out. She hesitated, fear written across her face, but the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs forced her hand. She dropped, landing with a grunt on the damp earth. Henry followed, twisting his ankle as he hit the ground. "Keep running," he yelled, ignoring the pain. They fled into the forest, the figure's guttural laughter chasing them through the trees. Eventually, the laughter faded and the forest began to thin. They stumbled onto a paved road just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. A car approached and they waved it down, their desperation evident. The driver, an older man, rolled down his window. "You two all right?" Henry nodded, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "Our car broke down. Can you take us to town?" The man agreed, and they climbed into the back seat, relief washing over them. As the car pulled away, Henry glanced out the window. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, he saw the figure standing motionless at the edge of the forest, its featureless face turned toward them. It raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave.
Next story.
The town of Ravenshallow was a forgotten dot on the map, shrouded in mist and mystery. Its single winding road, flanked by dense, towering pines, was notorious for its labyrinthine twists and turns. Those who veered off this road often didn't return. Locals whispered about the boundary, a place where the road led not to another destination but to something much darker. Eric was not a believer in ghost stories. A trucker by trade, he prided himself on his rationality. So, when his GPS malfunctioned during a late-night delivery, he wasn't particularly worried. He pulled to the side of the road, glancing at the static-filled screen. Recalculating, it droned over and over, the monotony blending with the eerie stillness of the night. The clock on his dashboard blinked 12. Strange. It had been working fine a moment ago. Eric cursed under his breath and scanned the dark road ahead. A single sign stood at the next fork. Merrick Road, 2 miles. Eric frowned. That name wasn't on his route plan, but he reasoned it could lead him to the highway. With no signal and no visible landmarks, he turned left onto Merrick Road. The moment his tires hit the gravel, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees grew impossibly tall, their twisted branches knitting together above the road to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. His headlights flickered, their beams swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The first 20 minutes passed uneventfully, though unease gnawed at him. The road was too quiet, too deserted. No deer, no rustling leaves, just the steady hum of his engine. Then he saw her. A figure stood on the side of the road, illuminated in his high beams. She wore a tattered white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the gloom. Her hair hung limp over her face, obscuring her features. Eric slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. The truck skidded to a stop mere feet from her. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. "Hey, are you okay?" he shouted, rolling down the window. She tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. Her silence unnerved him, but he couldn't just leave her there. He stepped out of the cab, keeping his distance. "Do you need a ride? Are you lost?" Still no response. Her head tilted further, an unnatural angle that made Eric's stomach churn. I can call someone," he stammered, though he knew his phone was useless here. He reached for his pocket anyway, more for comfort than anything else. When he looked up, she was gone. He spun around, searching the shadows. "Hello?" His voice echoed, but no one answered. Shaken, Eric climbed back into the truck and locked the doors. The figure was gone, but the unease lingered, coiled tight in his chest. He pressed on, determined to reach the highway. Merrick Road seemed endless. No matter how far he drove, the scenery didn't change. The same gnarled trees, the same suffocating canopy, the same mist that slithered along the ground like a living thing. His dashboard clock still blinked 12. That's when the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the engine. But as the minutes ticked by, they grew louder, more distinct. Voices murmured in a language he didn't recognize, their tones urgent and insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, Dask filling the cab. Eric cranked up the radio to drown them out, but it only emitted static. Frustration mounting, he shouted, "What do you want?" The voices stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then he saw the figure again. This time she stood in the middle of the road, her dress stained with something dark. Her head was tilted the same unnatural way, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Eric's foot hovered over the brake, but his instincts screamed at him to keep going. "Not real," he muttered to himself. "She's not real." He closed his eyes for a split second and floored the accelerator. When he opened them, she was gone. The truck barreled forward, and for a brief moment he thought he'd escaped. But then the cab grew cold, unnaturally cold. His breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to creep across the windshield. Suddenly, the truck lurched as though something massive had struck it. Eric struggled to keep control, his hands white-knuckling the wheel. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, mingling with a guttural growl that seemed to come from right behind him. He dared a glance in the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The woman was in the cab, sitting in the passenger seat. Her face was a hollow void, black and endless, but he could feel her gaze boring into him. She reached out a skeletal hand, her fingers impossibly long, and touched his arm. The truck skidded off the road. Eric woke to the smell of gasoline and the distant sound of cicadas. His truck lay on its side in a shallow ditch, its headlights shattered. He crawled out of the wreckage, his body aching but miraculously intact. The forest was quiet again, but the road was gone. In its place was a dirt path leading deeper into the woods. The air was thick with the stench of decay. In the distance, he saw a faint light. A cabin? A house? Desperate and disoriented, he stumbled toward it. As he approached, he realized it wasn't a cabin at all. It was a burning truck, its flames licking hungrily at the sky. His truck. And standing beside it was the woman, her hollow face turned toward him. She raised a hand and beckoned. Eric turned and ran, but no matter how far he went, the forest never ended. The whispers followed him, promising he'd never leave.
Next story.
The fog hung low, swallowing the road in a ghostly haze. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart pounding. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the tires against the cracked asphalt. She was late. The reunion was miles behind her now, and her desperation to make it home had led her to trust her GPS blindly when it suggested a detour. "Turn right," the GPS chirped. She obeyed, her headlights illuminating a narrow, winding road that disappeared into the thick woods. The trees pressed close, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Claire hesitated but kept driving. Her phone signal was long gone, and her sense of direction was failing her. The road twisted and turned, becoming narrower with each mile. The further she went, the more the unease grew in her chest. There were no signs, no houses, and no other cars. The only constant was the dense fog that seemed to thicken the deeper she ventured. Then she saw it. A dilapidated gas station. Relief flooded her as she pulled into the gravel lot. The building was a relic from another era, its wooden walls weathered and sagging. The single flickering light above the entrance cast eerie shadows across the cracked windows. She stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at her skin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. "Hello?" she called, pushing open the creaky door. The smell of dust and decay hit her like a wave. Inside, the gas station was dimly lit, its shelves lined with faded cans and outdated snacks. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face gaunt and lined, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. "Lost?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yeah," Claire admitted, her voice shaky. "I need directions back to the highway." The man's lips twisted into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't no highway for miles, but there's a road that'll get you back quicker. Take the old Ridgeway path. Follow it straight through." Claire nodded, uneasy but desperate. She bought a bottle of water, handed over some cash, and hurried back to her car. The old man watched her go, his expression unreadable. She drove away, following his instructions. The Ridgeway path was barely a road, a rutted dirt trail lined by trees so thick they formed a tunnel. Her headlights barely cut through the gloom, and the fog grew heavier, wrapping around her car like a shroud. Minutes turned to an hour, and there was no end in sight. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself. Claire felt a cold sweat on her forehead as a nagging thought crept in. She'd been here before. Then she saw something that made her heart stop. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. It was a man in a tattered jacket, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't flinch as she slowed to a crawl. Claire's pulse raced. "What the hell?" she whispered. She honked the horn, but the man didn't react. He stood there, still and silent, blocking her way. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but when she glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood ran cold. Another figure stood behind her car, identical to the first. Her breath quickened. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. She shifted the gear into reverse, but the second figure didn't budge. Their faces were hidden, but she felt their eyes on her, boring into her soul. Panicked, Claire yanked the wheel to the side and veered off the road, plunging into the forest. The car bounced over roots and rocks, the trees scraping against its sides. She didn't care. She just needed to get away. The figures didn't follow, but the forest itself seemed alive. Shadows danced between the trees, and strange whispers filled the air. The road had vanished, and Claire was completely lost. Her headlights caught something ahead, a house. It was small and ramshackle, its windows dark. She had no choice. She stopped the car and stumbled toward it, her legs shaking. The door creaked open before she could knock. Inside was a single room, sparsely furnished. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering light across the walls. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, knitting something from dark, coarse thread. "You're not supposed to be here," the woman said without looking up. "I got lost," Claire stammered. "Can you help me?" The old woman sighed, her hands never stopping. "You took the wrong turn. The road you're on, it doesn't let people leave." "What do you mean?" Claire's voice cracked. The old woman finally looked up, her eyes milky white and unseeing. "It's a place between places. It draws in the lost, the desperate. It doesn't let go easily." Claire's heart sank. "How do I get out?" The old woman pointed to a small mirror hanging on the wall. "There's only one way, but it comes at a cost." Before Claire could ask what she meant, the fire in the hearth flared violently, filling the room with blinding light. When the flames receded, the old woman was gone, and the house was silent. Claire approached the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, but something was off. The reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stood still, staring at her with hollow eyes. The reflection smiled. Claire screamed as the mirror shattered and the room was plunged into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her car, parked at the gas station. The morning sun was rising, the fog dissipating. She looked around, her hands trembling on the wheel. Everything seemed normal, but something felt wrong. Her reflection in the rearview mirror caught her eye. It wasn't her. It smiled.
Next story.
The fog rolled in thick as a wall, swallowing the narrow mountain road. Olivia squinted through the windshield, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. The trip to her sister's engagement party had been uneventful until her GPS insisted on taking her down this isolated stretch of road. Now the screen displayed a cryptic message. "Recalculating? Please wait." Frustrated, she muttered under her breath and slowed the car. The forest on either side of the road was dense, the trees looming like silent sentinels. It felt like the kind of place where time stood still. As Olivia rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her heart lurching. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. Olivia's mind raced. What was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She cracked the window slightly. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed down a narrow dirt path branching off the main road. Olivia's gaze followed the gesture, but the path disappeared into the fog. Something about him made her skin crawl. I think I'll just stay on this road," she stammered, rolling the window up. She eased the car forward, carefully steering around him. In her rearview mirror, she saw the man turn slowly to face her, his arms still outstretched. She drove faster. A few minutes later, Olivia's headlights caught a sign she hadn't noticed before. "Welcome to Barrows Hollow." The sign was old, its paint peeling and its edges splintered. She didn't remember seeing this town on the map, but the GPS was still useless, so she decided to stop and ask for directions. The road widened, revealing a small village nestled in the valley below. It looked quaint, almost picturesque, with cobblestone streets and charming, old-fashioned houses. But as she drove into town, an unsettling stillness settled over her. There were no people, no sounds of life. The windows of the houses were dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. She pulled into the parking lot of what looked like a diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly. "Open." The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and grease, but the diner was empty. The booths were neatly arranged, and a pot of coffee sat on the counter, steam curling lazily from its spout. Olivia called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. She stepped closer to the counter and noticed a stack of menus, each one pristine as though they'd just been printed. She flipped one open, but there was no text inside, just blank, glossy pages. The sound of the bell jingling behind her made her spin around, heart pounding. The door swung shut, but no one had entered. The diner's lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the walls. Olivia's breathing quickened as a sense of dread took hold. She turned back to the counter and froze. A man now sat at one of the booths, his back to her. He was dressed like the man on the road, with the same dark coat and hat. She hadn't heard him come in. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky. "Can you help me? I think I'm lost." The man didn't respond. Slowly, he turned his head and Olivia gasped. His face was pale, almost gray, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly. A thin, unnatural smile stretched across his lips, too wide for his face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Olivia backed away, her pulse racing. I just need directions." The man stood, impossibly tall, and pointed toward the door. "Leave now, while you still can." She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out of the diner, her heart hammering in her chest. Jumping into her car, she started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, her tires screeching on the cobblestones. The road back out of town was different. The trees were twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky. The fog was thicker, and Olivia's headlights seemed to illuminate shapes moving just out of sight. Her grip tightened on the wheel as she tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw him, the man in the hat, sitting in her back seat. His glowing eyes met hers in the mirror, and his grin widened. "You didn't listen," he said. Olivia screamed and swerved. The car spun out of control, sliding off the road and crashing into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and her vision blurred. When she came to, the car was silent, the headlights flickering weakly. She stumbled out, clutching her aching head, and looked around. The road was gone. The forest was gone. She stood in an empty expanse of gray mist, stretching endlessly in every direction. Her car was nowhere to be seen. A shadow emerged from the mist, tall, dark, and wearing a hat. "Welcome to Barrows Hollow," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You belong to us now." The fog closed in, swallowing her screams.
Next story.
The storm hit harder than anyone expected. The weather forecast had promised light rain, but by nightfall, the downpour had turned into a raging tempest. Evelyn and her boyfriend, Liam, were on their way back from a weekend at her parents' lake house. The winding roads through the countryside had already been challenging in daylight. In the stormy darkness, they were treacherous. "We should have left earlier," Evelyn muttered, gripping the edge of her seat as Liam navigated another sharp turn. The windshield wipers thrashed frantically, barely keeping up with the rain. "We're fine," Liam replied, though his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We'll hit the highway soon." But then, as if summoned by her unease, a detour sign appeared in their headlights. "Road closed. Detour this way." "Are you kidding me?" Liam groaned, slowing the car. "Just follow it," Evelyn said. "We don't have a choice." The detour led them onto a narrow, unpaved road. The trees on either side loomed like specters, their branches whipping in the wind. The rain turned the dirt into a thick, sticky mud, and the car's tires struggled for traction. "Are we even going the right way?" Evelyn asked after a few minutes. The road was devoid of other cars or signs of life. No streetlights, no houses, just an endless stretch of shadowy forest. Liam checked his phone, but the screen displayed, "No signal." He sighed. "We'll keep going for a bit. It has to lead somewhere." The road twisted and turned unnaturally, like it had been designed to disorient. After what felt like hours, the car's headlights illuminated a strange structure ahead. It was a gate, rusted and overgrown with ivy, with a faded sign that read, "Ashwick Asylum." Liam stopped the car. "An asylum? Out here?" Evelyn shuddered. "This can't be right. Let's turn back." "Back where?" Liam gestured to the dark road behind them. "We've been driving for miles. Let's just go through. Maybe there's another road on the other side." Reluctantly, Evelyn nodded. Liam pulled the car forward, the gate creaking open as if it had been waiting for them. The asylum loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the lightning-lit sky. It was enormous, its Gothic architecture riddled with broken windows and crumbling walls. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown, but eerily a single light burned near the main entrance. "Someone's here," Liam said, his voice tinged with relief. "Maybe they can help." Evelyn didn't share his optimism. "This place feels wrong. Let's just keep driving." But as they approached, the car sputtered and died. The engine let out a final, choking gasp before falling silent. "You've got to be kidding me," Liam muttered, trying the ignition again. Nothing. The light at the asylum's entrance flickered. Evelyn stared at it, her chest tightening. "Do you see that?" Liam followed her gaze. The light wasn't just flickering, it was pulsating, almost like it was breathing. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "I'll see if anyone's inside." "No way," Evelyn protested. "I'm not staying alone in this car." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, come with me, but stay close." The wind howled as they stepped out into the rain, the asylum towering over them like a slumbering beast. The flashlight's beam danced across the cracked pavement, illuminating patches of moss and scattered debris. The main doors were ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Liam pushed them open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood. "This place has been abandoned for years," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why is there a light on?" Liam didn't answer. He moved the flashlight across the lobby, stack, revealing peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and overturned furniture. Faded murals of smiling doctors and children adorned the walls, their cheerful expressions warped by decay. Then came the sound, faint at first like a distant echo, but growing louder, a rhythmic tapping like someone, or something, walking with purpose. Evelyn grabbed Liam's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But the tapping turned into a slow, dragging noise, accompanied by a low, guttural moan. The flashlight beam wavered as Liam's hand trembled. "Is someone there?" he called out. The moan stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Evelyn tugged at his sleeve. "Let's go." Before they could retreat, a figure emerged at the edge of the flashlight's range. It was a man, or what was left of one. His hospital gown hung in tatters, revealing patches of raw, discolored flesh. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Help me," the figure rasped, his voice wet and gurgling. Evelyn screamed, but the sound seemed to spur the figure into motion. He lurched forward, his steps uneven but unnervingly fast. Liam yanked Evelyn's hand and they ran deeper into the asylum, desperate to escape. The hallways twisted like the road outside, leading them in circles. Doors slammed shut behind them, and the air grew colder with every step. The sound of dragging footsteps followed, accompanied by whispered voices that seemed to come from the walls. "Over here!" Liam pulled Evelyn into a room and slammed the door shut. He wedged a broken chair under the handle and turned the flashlight off. They huddled in the darkness, their breaths ragged. The whispers grew louder, converging outside the door. Then came a soft knock. "Open the door," a childlike voice pleaded. "Please, I'm scared." Evelyn clamped her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The knock came again, more insistent. "Let me in." Liam shook his head silently, but then the door began to creak. The chair splintered as the knocking turned into furious pounding. A blinding light flooded the room, and Evelyn felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She screamed, and everything went black. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she was lying in the middle of the road. The storm was gone, and the forest was silent. Liam was nowhere to be seen. She stumbled to her feet, calling his name, but there was no response. Turning around, she saw the gate to Ashwick Asylum in the distance. It was closed, the sign rusted beyond recognition, a car's headlights appeared down the road, and Evelyn waved desperately. The vehicle slowed and a man leaned out of the window. Are you all right, miss? Are you all right, miss? I need help, she stammered. My boyfriend, he's... But when she turned back toward the is gone, the road stretched on, empty and endless.
Next story.
The countryside road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt flanked by overgrown fields. Sam and Lily sat in the car, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind sneaking through the cracked windows. They were returning from a weekend hiking trip, their moods buoyant until the GPS suddenly chirped, urging them to take an exit they hadn't planned on. Turn left, the GPS announced. Did we miss something? Lily asked. Frowning at the screen, Sam shrugged. It says it's a shortcut. Let's give it a shot. The The road narrowed as they turned, the pavement giving way to gravel. It wound through a dense forest, the trees arching overhead like an ominous cathedral. The sun had begun to set, and the soft light filtering through the branches grew dimmer with each passing moment. "Weird place for a shortcut," Lily muttered, glancing out the window. "This road doesn't look like it's been used in years." Sam was about to respond when the car jerked violently. He slammed on the brakes, and they both lurched forward. A sickening crunch followed as the car skidded to a halt. "What was that?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Sam stepped out and walked to the front of the car. The headlights illuminated a large branch tangled beneath the wheels. "Just some debris," he called over his shoulder. "Give me a sec." As he worked to dislodge the branch, Lily sat tensely, her fingers drumming against the dashboard. The forest felt alive around them, the shadows shifting unnaturally. She thought she heard faint whispers, too low to make out. "Sam," she called, her voice tight. "Hurry up, I don't like this." Sam didn't answer. Lily turned to look at him, and her heart stopped. He was standing still, staring into the forest, his hands limp at his sides. "Sam?" she called again, stepping out of the car. She approached him cautiously, her breath visible in the sudden chill. "What are you looking at?" He pointed into the trees. "There's someone out there." Lily followed his gaze, squinting into the gloom. At first, she saw nothing, but then a figure emerged, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her pale face glowing faintly in the fading light. Her hair hung in matted strands, and her eyes seemed to pierce the darkness like a predator's. "Get in the car," Lily whispered, tugging on Sam's arm. The woman took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were testing the ground. Sam didn't move. His eyes were locked on the woman, his expression blank. "Sam!" Lily shouted, shaking him. Finally, he blinked, as though waking from a trance, and allowed her to drag him back to the car. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the gravel road, leaving the figure behind. Lily's heart was pounding, her hands gripping the dashboard. "What was that? Did you see her eyes?" "I don't know," Sam muttered, his voice hollow. The car jolted again, harder this time, and came to a sudden stop. The engine sputtered and died, plunging them into eerie silence. "No, no, no!" Sam yelled, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine wouldn't turn over. Lily stared out the windshield, her breath catching. The woman was back. She stood in the center of the road, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes glowing brighter now. She was closer than before, and this time she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the forest, men, women, children, all in old, tattered clothing. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow voids. They moved as one, stepping closer and closer to the car. "Lock the doors!" Lily screamed, fumbling with the button. The windows fogged up as the figures surrounded them, pressing their hands against the glass. Their touch left smears of black, oily residue that seemed to pulse and writhe. Sam slammed his fist against the steering wheel. "Come on!" he shouted, twisting the key again and again. The car roared to life, and they shot forward, the figures scattering into the darkness. The road became rougher, the gravel turning into mud. The car skidded and lurched as Sam fought to control it. The forest grew thicker, the trees leaning in as if trying to trap them. "Are we going in circles?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. Sam didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. The GPS screen flickered, the route recalculating over and over. Finally, it froze, the screen going black. A sudden drop loomed ahead, a sharp descent into darkness. Sam slammed on the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop. It careened over the edge, plunging into the abyss. When Sam and Lily opened their eyes, they were back on the same gravel road. The car was unscathed, the forest eerily still. The GPS was functioning again, directing them to the highway. Did that just happen?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Sam nodded, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. Without a word, he turned the car around and sped back the way they had come. Hours later, they emerged from the forest, the comforting sight of a gas station greeting them. They pulled in, shaking and exhausted. Inside, the cashier, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked up from his counter. "Y'all look like you've seen a ghost." We took the Ridgeway shortcut," Sam stammered. The man's expression darkened. "Ridgeway? Son, that road's been closed for decades. It leads nowhere but trouble." As they left the gas station, the cashier watched them go, muttering under his breath, "Lucky to have made it out at all." Far behind them, deep in the forest, the woman in the tattered dress stood watching, her hollow eyes glowing faintly as the whispers in the woods resumed.
Next story.
The desert highway stretched on, an unbroken line cutting through the vast expanse of sand and scrub. Jackson, an exhausted truck driver hauling his final load of the week, leaned forward in his seat, squinting at the horizon. The sun had long since set, leaving the sky an inky black void. His headlights carved shallow tunnels of light through the night, but the road seemed endless. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the oppressive silence. "Breaker 19, anyone out there tonight?" Jackson grabbed the mic. "Yeah, this is Lone Wolf. Who's calling?" "Name's Red Rover. Just checking in. You near mile marker 64? Jackson frowned. "Not yet, but I'm close." "Why?" There was a pause, then the other voice came back, lower and more serious. "When you get to 64, take the long way around. Trust me." Before Jackson could respond, the line went dead. He tapped the mic a couple of times. "Red Rover? You still there?" No answer. Shrugging it off as a prank, Jackson kept driving. The road was eerily deserted. No headlights ahead or behind, no sign of life except the occasional tumbleweed skittering across the asphalt. A sign loomed out of the darkness. Mile marker 63. "Almost there," Jackson muttered. The words from the radio nagged at him, but he shook them off. Truckers had all kinds of superstitions about stretches of road, most of them baseless. Then he saw it. Mile marker 64. The post was crooked, the numbers faintly illuminated by his headlights. As he passed it, the air inside the cab grew colder, his breath puffing out in clouds despite the summer heat. His dashboard clock flickered, the numbers shifting and distorting before freezing at 3:33 a.m., though he was certain it wasn't that late. Something flickered in the corner of his vision, a shadow crossing the road far ahead. Jackson slowed the truck, his pulse quickening. Whatever it was, it moved unnaturally, too fast and fluid for an animal. He came to a stop and scanned the road. The darkness beyond his headlights felt alive, heavy with an unseen presence. He leaned forward, trying to catch another glimpse of the shadow when his radio crackled again. "Lone Wolf," Red Rover's voice hissed. "You didn't listen." A chill ran down Jackson's spine. "Who is this? What's going on?" "Keep driving," the voice said. "Don't stop. Don't look." Jackson's hand hovered over the gear shift, torn between moving forward and turning back. Before he could decide, a sharp thud jolted the truck. It came from the roof, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the metal. Heart pounding, Jackson grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the cab, the cold night air biting at his skin. He shone the beam up at the roof, but saw nothing. The empty highway stretched out around him, silent and oppressive. Then he heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the darkness. He spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam caught a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him from the edge of the road. Whatever it was stepped into the light, and Jackson's blood ran cold. The creature was humanoid but impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over jagged bones, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Jackson backed toward the truck, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature took a step forward, then another, its movements unnervingly deliberate. He scrambled into the cab, locking the doors and slamming the truck into gear. The tires screeched as he floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck barreled down the road. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature loping after him, its long arms reaching out as though it could grab the truck by sheer will. The CB radio crackled again. "Don't stop, Lone Wolf. Whatever you do, don't stop." The creature was gaining, its inhuman strides closing the gap. Jackson's knuckles were white on the wheel, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the thing in the mirror. Suddenly, the road forked, one path leading straight ahead, the other veering sharply to the right. Without thinking, Jackson took the right fork. The truck swayed dangerously as it rounded the curve, and for a moment he thought it would tip over. But when he looked in the mirror again, the creature was gone. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The new road was narrow and lined with ancient, withered trees whose branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel. The cold returned, more biting than before, and the truck's headlights dimmed, barely illuminating the path. Then he saw them, figures standing in the road ahead, dozens of them, their silhouettes motionless and identical. As he drew closer, Jackson's stomach twisted. The figures had no faces, just smooth, featureless heads atop shadowy forms. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. It rolled forward as though pulled by an unseen force, the figures parting silently to let him pass. Jackson gripped the wheel, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears. The radio crackled one last time. "You can't outrun them, Lone Wolf. You've already crossed over." "What does that mean?" Jackson shouted into the mic, desperation creeping into his voice. But there was no answer, only static. The road opened up, leading to a massive, dilapidated gate. Beyond it was a void, an expanse of swirling darkness that seemed to go on forever. The truck slowed, then stopped on its own as though the engine had given up. Jackson sat frozen, staring at the void, his hands trembling on the wheel. The figures from the road began to appear around the truck, their featureless faces turned toward him. The last thing Jackson heard before the figures closed in was the eerie, hollow sound of Red Rover's voice. "Welcome to mile marker 64.